Matt Walsh. Have I covered him on this channel? I'm not 100% certain. It's a thing I might have done, that then again, I'm probably wrong. Actually, no, I have covered him. He was the guy saying he wanted it to be hard for people to vote. Right, the guy who's anti-democracy. Got it. That one. He could say he's not anti-democracy, but this is the difference between intent and consequence. So, what does he have to say for us today? Well, he says that leftism is indistinguishable from insanity. Now, leftism is generally poorly defined here in America. Usually they mean anything liberal or otherwise that's not conservative. My definition of leftism would be somebody who advocates for the economic principles of the left, whether this be socialism, democratic socialism, whether this be communism. Basically, leftist would be somebody who does not agree with capitalism. So I wouldn't really consider a liberal a leftist, because usually liberals are okay with capitalism, or whatever the status quo in the area happens to be. So let's go ahead and take a look at Matt Walsh's video and see what he's got to say.
Well, it's immensely tempting to say that Democrat senators questioning Amy Coney Barrett during her confirmation hearings this week are engaging in quite a lot of mansplaining. The condescension is there, the unnecessary, long-winded lectures, the interruptions.
The interruptions and lectures, you mean the things that happen every single time a Supreme Court person gets brought in? Do you remember all the stuff Brett Kavanaugh had to go through to get elected? Do you remember all of the shit? Sir, can you please tell us what a devil's triangle is? Sir, can you please explain to us what boofing is? I don't know. I like beer. That whole shtick should invalidate Matt's opinion here right now.
They're even using poster boards and other visual aids to get their points across. The only reason I won't call any of this mansplaining is that the term is vapid and stupid and used unironically only by people whose minds have been warped by politics and ideology.
People whose minds have been warped by politics and ideology, Matt. Interesting. I have no idea what one of those people might look like. I have no idea what someone whose mind warped by politics, writing for the Daily Wire maybe, what that person might look like. That idea of a person whose mind could be so warped and shaped by politics and personal ideology, that person I have no idea where I'd find a person like that. No idea. But I guess we can keep looking.
Still, by the left's rules, applied equitably, as they like to say, it must be concluded that Barrett's inquisitors are sexist bullies, even the women who are apparently infected with internalized misogyny.
No. If we find that somebody has ideas that we oppose, and we find that that person is not fit for office because they've been a judge for only 3 years and they're literally being shoved in at the last possible fucking second during an election year, which was a time when Mitch McConnell tried to argue we shouldn't be putting a person in on an election year because apparently that wasn't a thing that was done for like 70 years. The idea that we shouldn't do this is for a myriad of other reasons. None of them were because she was a woman. She was not being grilled because she was a woman. It just happens to function well for Matt Walsh's victim mentality. That this person was a woman because he gets to go, aha! I get to play the victim game now, but you're not even playing it right.
Or some such nonsense. But if the meaning and application of mansplaining changes according to the political needs of the moment, at least the word is contrived and meaningless from the start.
All words are contrived. Every word is contrived. Every word in every language that has ever been spoken is contrived and meaningless. They all only have application within the context of the sentence they are being spoken in, and they mean something different from the person who says it to the person who receives it. Language has no meaning. It has interpretation, it has usage, but the only people who can argue that it has meaning, internalized, deontological meaning, would be linguistic prescriptivists, of which nobody who actually engages in writing things like dictionaries are, strangely enough. It's not that these terms are vapid. It's that they have a functional usage that changes depending on the speaker and the context. Like every other word in every other language.
The left invented that term. I suppose they can do whatever they want with it.
Everybody invents terms. That's how words work. That's how words work.
The far more disturbing thing is to witness how real words that existed before our era of woke politics, are now redefined with rapid speed on the fly and with coordinated efficiency.
Real words. Real words. Matt, all words matter.
The hearings have provided us with perhaps the most glaring and most striking example of the left's language manipulation scheme that we've seen yet. And we talked about the game.
Language manipulation scheme from the guy on the right-hand side of politics who constantly, pre-Trump era, had to engage in pseudonyms. Not pseudonyms, euphemisms. There we go. That's the word I'm looking for. Who constantly had to engage in euphemisms to get their point across. And if you haven't seen Innuendo Studio's wonderful video, Death of a Euphemism, to understand what I'm talking about, I would highly suggest doing so.
Game they're playing with the term court packing already, but this is way worse than that. So on Tuesday morning, as you ate your breakfast burrito, the term sexual preference was perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable, perfectly common.
No, because if you've actually been in lefty spaces, which Matt is not in, sexual preference as a term has been debated for quite a few years. The first time I was aware of the debate was about 2 years ago, where I mentioned sexual preference, and one of my friends, who, admittedly was LGBTQ, responded, "It's not my preference. I don't have a choice in the matter. It's not that I prefer men to women, much in the same way I don't just prefer a type of food group. It's that I functionally cannot choose women and have to choose men. Because my brain is not wired in a way to allow me to make a choice otherwise. It's not a preference." Now, for nomenclature's sake, I have no problem with the term, but then again, I'm also cis, so I have less of a stake in this conversation myself. I'm okay saying sexual preference, but the fact of the matter is, this conversation has existed for a while. You can have a preference on things like food, but I can just consume the food that I want. It doesn't work that way with who you're attracted to. I think a lot of people are more comfortable with the term attraction because they can't get attraction to, like, if I were gay, I would not be able to have attraction to somebody who I deemed as female, for the most part. It's not a preference thing at that point. It's an inability to do otherwise. That's not a preference. If the only thing on my plate is a burger, it's not my preference that made me eat the burger. It was my inability to choose otherwise.
And if you used it anywhere, everyone would know what you meant, and almost nobody would think to be offended by it. By bedtime, as you crawled beneath your covers, sexual preference had become an unspeakable slur. In the span of 18 hours, this new meaning had been adopted by the media, politicians, even the dictionary itself. Anyone who wasn't paying attention to the news on Wednesday will no doubt use this newly minted gay slur at some point in the future and be utterly baffled and horrified by the looks and breathless chastisements that follow.
It is never that fast, Matt. It is never that fast. Language does not just... Again, what is more likely? Is it more likely that an entire conspiracy happened while you were asleep? Or is it more likely that these things happened under your radar and have been happening for years under your radar, and they just came to the surface now because there was a catalyst? Like in all chemical reactions, all the underlying shit is there. You just need a catalyst to make the reaction start. What is more likely? Everything being there from the beginning? Or this conspiracy? You call us insane, but yet you're appealing to a giant conspiracy of language.
That, of course, was part of the plan. So how did this happen? During the course of the confirmation hearings early on Tuesday, Amy Coney Barrett responded to a question about gay rights, and she said that she would, quote, never discriminate on the basis of sexual preference. Here she is in her own words. Listen.
And I do want to be clear that I have never discriminated on the basis of sexual preference and would not ever discriminate on the basis of sexual preference. You know, like racism, I think discrimination is abhorrent.
Gasp. Shocking. Well, not really. To most observers, this seems like a totally normal statement, hardly noteworthy. But some on the left, sensing that Barrett would give them few opportunities to be offended, decided to make do with what they had. So leftist Twitter accounts began setting the stage.
Oh, you're going to do that thing where instead of criticizing an individual for their individual tweets, you criticize an entire group of people based on an individual. This is the reason why when I talk about evangelicals or fundamental Christians, I have to say every single time, this is what you see with a majority. This is what you see with a group of. This is what you see with extremist variants of. I generally try not to say this is what you see all the time with evangelicals. This is what you see all the time with fundamentalists. This is what you see all the time with bigots. Because it's never that fucking simple. The world does not exist in a convenient set of binaries. I mean, it doesn't work that way with gender either. But the world does not exist as a convenient set of binaries, Matt. But if in your brain it does, then it's easy for you to have this essentially a good-evil distinction where the good is on the right and the evil is on the left. And then you get to accuse the other people of doing the same thing. But let's see what the Twitter account said, insofar as that's even a functional argument. I mean, it's going to be hasty generalization in any case, but let's see what he says anyway.
Claiming that the judge's use of the term sexual preference is somehow abhorrent. All of a sudden. It wasn't.
It's not an all of a sudden thing. I guess I was privy to this fucking conversation 2 years ago.
Before it is now. Kyle Griffin, an MSNBC producer with almost 1 million followers.
The amount of followers he has is irrelevant here, dude.
Was early on the bandwagon, tweeting, "Sexual preference, a term used by Justice Barrett, is offensive and outdated. The term implies sexuality is a choice. It is not. News organizations should not repeat Justice Barrett's words without providing that important context."
Not untrue. I'm actually okay with that take. That's not trying to throw Amy under the bus. That's literally pointing out, hey, this is kind of outdated language. Like, as an example, here's an example of outdated language. If I say that somebody engages in the gay lifestyle, well, what the fuck is the gay lifestyle? I might have 5 gay friends with completely different lifestyles, and one of them might be exactly like mine, except for the fact that he pegs his husband on Tuesdays routinely. What's the gay lifestyle to them? Well, it's completely vapid. It means nothing. But it's a term we coined a long time ago because it allowed us to otherize people of different sexualities. Sexual preference is not quite the same thing, but it is close in that sexual preference, as accepted nomenclature, is something that we're okay with saying most of the time. But there is an implication there that sometimes has to be given proper context. Here's the reason why this is important. How many times have you had the conversation with somebody about something like BLM, where you say Black Lives Matter, and they go, all lives matter, and you have to point out, that's implied in Black Lives Matter. It's just we're trying to bring notice to a particular aspect of life that goes unnoticed generally otherwise. Just like Cancer Awareness Month does not suddenly mean we need to stop being aware of chlamydia, of AIDS, of freaking other diseases that happen to crop up from time to time. We don't suddenly just forget Ebola exists because of Cancer Awareness Month. You're merely bringing notice to a thing. And sometimes that context is important to give, and that's basically what Kyle Griffin is saying here. Please provide that context because the term is outdated without that proper context. There's nothing about that take that's really horrible.
Various others joined the chorus. Eventually, they seem to have attracted the attention of Senator Mazie Hirono, who leapt into action. That evening, Hirono circled back to scold Barrett, calling her choice of language offensive and outdated, repeating Kyle Griffin's tweet verbatim. She then explained that only, quote, anti-LGBTQ activists use the term because they want to suggest that sexual orientation is a choice, when in fact, says Hirono, it is a key part of an individual's identity, and it is, she says, immutable.
Which is not untrue. Can you, Matt Walsh, let's pretend you're straight for a second. Can you suddenly choose to be gay tomorrow? Not just peg your Uncle Tom But can you choose to be attracted in that way? Can you choose to have the myriad of experiences that lead you to that conclusion suddenly, like that? You can't. It's functionally like trying to convince yourself that Australia doesn't exist. Quite easy for a flat earther because they're wrong from the get-go, but not easy for standard people to do. Not a thing you can really just do without provocation.
Listen.
This morning, Senator Feinstein asked you a question about the Supreme Court's 2015 decision in Obergefell v. Hodges, a case in which the court recognized the constitutional right to same-sex marriage. And I was disappointed that you wouldn't give a direct answer on whether you agreed with the majority in that case, or if you instead agreed with your mentor, Justice Scalia, that no such right exists in the Constitution. So even though you didn't give a direct answer, I think your response did speak volumes. Not once, but twice. You used the term sexual preference to describe those in the LGBTQ community. And let me make clear, sexual preference is an offensive and outdated term. It is used by anti-LGBTQ activists to suggest that sexual orientation is a choice.
Which is not an untrue statement in its own, and I hope that my comment section would be a wealth of evidence of this. I have seen people who are anti-LGBTQ in my comment section constantly arguing that this is a choice. Or even worse, you have some Christian activists who try to argue that sexual preference is a choice of behavior. While they can't change the attraction, the behavior is abhorrent, and so they just shouldn't do the behavior. In either case, you're denying people the ability to manifest their identity in a way that's completely unharmful to anyone else, except for, like, your feelings, but facts don't really care about those.
It is not. Sexual orientation is a key part of a person's identity. That sexual orientation is both a normal expression of human sexuality and immutable was a key part of the majority's opinion in Obergefell, which, by the way, Scalia did not agree with. So if it is your view that sexual orientation is merely a preference, as you noted, then the LGBTQ community should be rightly concerned whether you would uphold their constitutional right to marry.
And then, expectedly...
Wait. Are you gonna... You're just gonna cut to yourself there? I'd like to hear her response. I feel like Amy's response there could be very important.
Cory Booker, never missing an opportunity to grandstand, also jumped in to register his objection to the term.
Judge Barrett, 5 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution protects the rights of same-sex couples to marry. This was a Obergefell case, which has been discussed today. The court declared the Constitution grants LGBTQ Americans equal dignity in the eyes of the law. Hundreds of thousands of couples have built their lives on this decision. I've married some of them myself. On that day 5 years ago, the court fulfilled really that ideal of equal justice under law. And yet now the same-sex marriage is legal. We've seen efforts to try to undermine that decision. Justice Ginsburg wrote about legal rules that would, quote, create two kinds of marriage, full marriage and skim milk marriage. I firmly believe that our laws shouldn't allow discrimination against people on the basis of who they are. I have a number of questions on this topic if I can get through them, but I wanted to offer you a further opportunity to address the issue that I don't think you got to fully address that my colleague brought up. When you did use the term sexual preference earlier today, rather than sexual orientation, is there a difference and what is it?
Senator, I really, in using that word, did not mean to imply that I think that, that it's not a matter of, that it's not an immutable characteristic or that it's solely a matter of preference. I honestly did not mean any offense or to make any statement by that.
But by what you just said, you understand about that immutable characteristic. In other words, that one's sexuality is not a preference, it is who they are. Is that what you're saying?
Senator, I'm saying I was not trying to make any comment on it.
Wait. No, now we do have an issue. Now we actually do have an issue, now that she is responding. Instead of agreeing with the truism that this is an immutable characteristic, she's just trying to go, I didn't mean to offend you. I didn't mean to offend people. That is not the same thing as agreeing.
Fully respect all the rights of the LGBT community. Obergefell is an important precedent of the court. I reject any kind of discrimination on any sort of basis.
And then it was off to the races. Slate, Jezebel, Vox, other outlets all joined the dog pile, publishing articles condemning sexual preference as offensive, degrading, bigoted, adult.
And she even decided during that, during that actual thing, she flat out did not agree that it's an immutable characteristic. She just, at least in the clip that you showed, Matt, just argued she did not mean to offend with that, or did not mean to imply that it was a choice, but she didn't agree with the immutable characteristic part. Now, why would that be? Now, I'm not trying to throw shade at Amy Coney Barrett for this. Of course, there's plenty of things I could throw shade for, like all the Handmaid's Tale shit from before. But if I were to label a criticism here, or throw a criticism out here, that criticism would be If you believe that it is not a choice, but you do not believe that it's an immutable characteristic, then you must believe that it could be changed by some other mechanism. Now, what other mechanism would we use to change somebody's sexuality, their orientation, when it is not a choice of theirs one way or the other? There is a, thankfully, slowly being eroded method that has been used for years: gay conversion therapy. This is not Amy Coney Barrett trying to stand gay conversion therapy. But I am pointing out that if you are a justice, if you are somebody who's going to be engaged in the interpretation of laws, it is important to have the conversation about why certain language is used. Because if you actively choose not to use certain language, it, especially if you are legally trained, it leaves the door open for other things. Now, granted, it should also be noted that when it comes to justices, a lot of times when they're in the middle of these grilling sessions, they do everything in their power to be as inoffensive as possible. And a lot of times, whatever their opinions are, do not get communicated through as adequately because they're trying to be as inoffensive as possible. So you have to still take what they say in hearings like this with a grain of salt. But I can at least understand the perspective that there's an issue with sexual preference coming out as the specific term being used, while also coupled with the fact that she's not arguing that sexuality is immutable. Is there anything else here that I really should be caring about?
Dog whistle. We must say orientation, not preference. They all suddenly agreed. Our sexuality is not a preference. It is ingrained. It is fundamental. It is an unchangeable part of our essence as human beings. And to cap it all off, Webster's Online Dictionary changed its definition of the word preference at the end of the night to note that it is offensive when applied to sexuality. Now, of course,
do you have any evidence that it was at the end of the night? Webster's Dictionary. That's the one we're using, right? When was this? Oh, that one is holy shit, you're actually right. You're actually right. Let's see here. Yep. He is actually correct here. On this one thing so far, I have to grant it to him. Merriam-Webster did update its entry, at least according to Snopes, on October 13th, following the confirmation hearing. It pays to do your due diligence. It pays to do your research. That still doesn't sound like a conspiracy to me. That just sounds like, oh shit, we need to catch up with the times. But either way, I am actually glad that that one is correct. I prefer when I can engage in steel manning.
Dictionary definitions change to reflect evolving meanings and common usages, and that's fine. But the usage and meaning of preference has not evolved. The left.
But it did. This conversation has been going on for at least 2 years, probably more, depending on circles who are more ingrained in it. This conversation has been going on, dude.
To include now the dictionary is not merely noting a change in common usage, but trying to effect a change by pretending that it has already occurred.
This is like when Steven Anderson got really fucking mad that gay people used the term gay to describe them being homosexual when it was used as a slur against them for so long, and Steven Anderson goes, it always meant happy. It always meant happy. I wish my kids were gay. I want my marriage to be gay. It's the same thing. Dude, the dictionary changed once. Why are you being a snowflake?
Words evolve gradually and organically over many years. Changes in language in our society are, rather than gradual and organic, sudden, artificial, orchestrated, ideological.
Definitions change ideologically all the time. This is how people like you have argued that Democrats are functionally on the left. The Southern strategy was an ideological change of definitions, where the right and left wings effectively flipped. Dude, maybe if you're going to throw stones, A glass house is not the best place to do it from.
And this is a very different sort of thing. Now, it's probably no use to point this out, but many of the people and media outlets lambasting Barrett for her use of sexual preference have themselves uttered or written it many times over the years. The Advocate, for example, blasted the
Tu quoque fallacy. This is a tu quoque. Now, granted, I just engaged in it myself with the throw stones from glass houses shit. I just engaged in the exact same whataboutism. But an insult it does make, an argument it does not make.
LGBTQ plus language only 2 weeks after publishing an article that makes uncritical use of that same term. Slate professed to be so alarmed by Barrett's language after years of using the exact same language in its articles. Indeed, just this year, Slate's advice column featured a question from a 65-year-old straight man wondering if his, quote, sexual preference may have changed over time as he finds himself fantasizing about men. And he decided to write Slate about this. The response from Slate writer Rich Juzwiak certainly does not sound consistent with sexual orientation as an immutable characteristic. This is what he says. Quote, from Slate. Some people keep evolving sexually, finding different things they're into at different times. In an episode of Netflix's Sex Explained, fantasies are compared to language. Research suggests we don't unlearn old ones, but we can learn new ones. Dr. Justin Lay Miller, who has studied fantasies extensively, suggests that one way of picking up new sexual interests would be exposure, via porn, for example, to something novel when on the brink of orgasm. For many, that's when the disgust response is reduced. The ensuing orgasm could prompt the stimulus to be sought again, and a new fantasy/kink is born. Okay, that's Slate. Evolving sexually, new sexual interests, a new fantasy is born.
Those are not the same things as your orientation or attraction. If I suddenly become attracted to... I'm trying to think of something pornographic but not like super offensive. If I did not find myself attracted to, say, the idea of threesomes, and then after the age of 30, I just happened to slowly fantasize about it more, my inclination sexually may have changed to include the idea of threesomes more. But up until that point, I did not. Now, did my actual attraction to a particular gender/sex change? No, which is what we're talking about here. Fantasies are not the same things as the genders attached to them. And yet, that's what Matt has to pull from. Now, granted, he does have a point. I am going to grant where it's true. He does have a point that previous publications, and even myself, have engaged in flippant use of the term sexual preference. But if there is a consensus, linguistically, at some point, that, hey, maybe this term is a bit outdated. Just like the R slur. I remember where we just used it as a synonym for stupid. A long time. We used it as a synonym for stupid. And then people started to get a little more aware of the fact that, wait, hold on, this kind of marginalizes a community. This marginalizes a group of people who are not really different from us. They just, well, not different from us in a majority of ways, but they are different just enough to where this term marginalizes them. It otherizes them. That conversation is a perfectly normal one to have, and it leads to linguistic change. Is there anything else in here that I should care for?
This makes sexual orientation sound an awful lot like a preference that can be changed.
No, it doesn't, because none of that talked about orientation. That talked about fantasies. Now, the original person who sent the message to Slate said his ideas about gender may have changed. He found himself fantasizing about men more. That did not say that he was attracted at that point, nor was there a confirmation from Slate. This is still in the realm of talking about fantasies. But that's just... And even then, orientation can be something that's fluid, but still immutable. Immutable just means it's a part of you. It's a thing that you don't have any ability to change itself. But that orientation can itself change. Again, remember, my perspective is one that free will does not necessarily exist. There's a subconscious factor that takes care of all this shit, and we have a wonderful illusion of free will, and we pragmatically have to operate as if we have it. But that still ends up with us being in the reality where these things are immutable. They're outside of ourselves and they influence ourselves. If that's all Matt Walsh is going to say, then I think we can move to the Among Us stream here in a couple of minutes. Let's see.
And in many cases does change. There are many real-world examples of this happening. Slate itself provided one of them. Sexual orientation is immutable is dogma, impotently asserting itself against the reality that clearly contradicts and disproves it.
No. You're you're having to use a completely separate thing to argue that. You're having to use sexual fantasy to argue against sexual orientation in order to make your usage of the term sexual preference acceptable. Again, me as a cis male, I don't give a fuck about sexual preference as a term, but I can see how that term can marginalize another person. I can see how it minimizes the people who they love. But if that's all Matt's going to say, if that's all we have from him is a giant straw man, then I think we're basically done with this part.
Besides, there is an inescapable logical problem for adherents to left-wing gender theory who also claim sexual orientation as ingrained and unchangeable. The problem is that...
No. Because sex and gender are different, Matt.
Their gender theories cannot coexist with their theory of sexual orientation.
Yes, they can. If sex and gender are different, then yes, they can.
These are mutually exclusive propositions for reasons that should be obvious.
Only
Take the
if he's
example of a gay
strong.
man who transitions into a woman. If he is really a woman now, he is no longer gay. Thus, sexual orientation can change. If he must always be...
No. From my point of view, if this person is a woman now, I am let's say I'm 20 years old. I have a friend who presents as male, operates as male, and to me is male. That's our lived experience. And then we don't see each other for 15 years. 15 years later, they've had gender affirmation surgery, they've had HRT, and they look like a bombshell. And I am now rock hard when I see them. That didn't suddenly make me gay, because if that made me gay and changed my own immutable sexual characteristic, that would be invalidating their gender. But that's not how it works. My attraction did not change. I am still attracted to women. And this person presents as a woman, and in my brain reads as a woman, and I am now attracted to them. This is a straw man, Matt. This is a straw man. And I don't think it's because you don't understand these things. You've engaged in these conversations enough to understand them. I think you're ingrained in a world where you have to misunderstand them because your base misunderstands them. And it is more responsible for you to please your base than it is to actually engage with reality. That's as far as I'm going to get into that particular video. So, who wants to do Among Us?